The question drifted, unspoken yet all-encompassing, through the suffocating corridors of Holion-IX, a hive city so vast and decayed that entire generations lived and died without ever seeing the sky. It was a place where people were born into metal tunnels and died in metal coffins, a place where the smell of rust, sweat, and industrial fumes clung to every surface. Holion-IX was a city that groaned with its own weight, its pipes always leaking, its vents always humming, its population always one breath away from despair. And in all the chaos of its machinery and misery, there existed a man most citizens never even noticed. Corvus Renn, janitor of the lower maintenance decks, cleaner of places no one else ever cared to look. Corvus had spent 27 years scrubbing the same industrial tiles, breathing the same recycled air, and sweeping the same forgotten walkways. The workers around him came and went, but he remained, as constant and unnoticed as the grime he fought against. He was thin and angular, with a face carved not by age but by worry. His uniform was always slightly too large, patched in half a dozen places, though he kept it cleaner than any supervisor ever demanded. He worked quietly, almost reverently, as if maintaining cleanliness in a hive drowning in filth was an act of defiance. To everyone else, he was forgettable, just another maintenance laborer in a city that ate its workers whole. But Corvus noticed things. He always had. Even as a child, he noticed things others ignored. The pattern of rot on a wall, the strange smell in a corridor, the way a shadow moved in a place where there was no one to cast it. He was the kind of person who picked up a piece of trash not because he was told to, but because disorder made him uneasy. That unease had a source, buried deep in memory. He had been 7 during the Void Plague incident on his home settlement. It had taken his parents, his neighbors, nearly everyone he knew. But Corvus survived, and although he never fully understood why he had been spared, he never forgot the scent of decay that had heralded the sickness, nor the whispers people claimed to hear as the plague consumed them. Others dismissed those memories as trauma-induced hallucinations. Corvus knew better. Corvus remembered the truth. Some corruption was alive. Every morning in Holion-IX began the same. Corvus unlocked the supply closet in Maintenance Block 17, checked his equipment, and recorded notes in his battered logbook, notes no one ever read. He tracked water leakage percentages, pipe pressure anomalies, mold patterns. It was the kind of obsessive attention that supervisors found unnecessary and even mildly irritating. But Corvus could not stop himself. Some part of him believed that cleanliness was not just a task but a shield, one he never wished to see fail again. So he walked the corridors with quiet precision, smoothing out the chaos of the hive in the only way he could. But on this particular morning, something felt different. The air tasted stale, as if spoiled. Corvus paused mid-step and sniffed. A faint sourness lingered at the edge of perception, mixed with a damp, earthy undertone that did not belong in a metal hive. He frowned and knelt beside a drainage grate, lifting it with practiced ease. Inside, instead of the usual sludge, he found threads of greenish mold spreading like veins, glowing faintly in the dim light. He recoiled. Mold did not grow here, not in sealed maintenance channels where chemical flushes ran every 6 hours. For mold to persist meant something was wrong far beyond mere neglect. He closed the grate slowly, heart tightening. The smell felt familiar, too familiar. He checked the vents next and found condensation dripping in thick, sticky beads rather than normal. Moisture. His mind whispered warnings he tried to dismiss. He had been wrong before, he told himself. Sometimes dampness was just dampness. Sometimes mold was just mold. But deep down, he sensed something waking within the hive's walls. The workers around him trudged on without noticing anything amiss. They coughed, cursed, laughed, and argued as always, their boots splashing through filth that had never once frightened them. They brushed past Corvus as if he didn't exist, and in their world, he didn't. He was the invisible man of Holion-IX, just another background figure maintaining the illusion of functionality. But today, as he continued his route, he heard two line workers complaining that their bunkroom had been filled with a strange damp smell overnight. Another group whispered that maintenance staff 3 had called in sick, though he had been perfectly healthy yesterday. A Medicae officer passed by with a datapad showing a spike in respiratory cases. Individually, these details meant little, but Corvus' instincts pieced them together with dreadful clarity. Something was happening, something rising. As he pushed his cart into a dim corridor leading to the lower venting junction, he felt the cold certainty settle into his chest. He had felt this before, once, long ago in another dying settlement. He whispered to himself, barely audible, "Not again, Emperor, not again." His pulse quickened, his breath sharpening. He sensed the hive shifting, changing, reacting to something hidden within its depths. Corvus Renn, Janitor, unseen and uncelebrated, was the first person in Holion-IX to understand that the city was beginning to rot from the inside out. And although he didn't know it yet, he would soon become the only person capable of stopping what was coming. In Hive City Holion-IX, catastrophe never arrived with warning sirens. It crept in through rusted pipes, cluttered corridors, and forgotten corners. And as we dive deeper into this story, keep watching until the end, because the final revelation of how a mere janitor saved millions is something even seasoned Imperial veterans struggle to believe. Corvus Renn felt the Hive's unease before anyone else did. That subtle sourness in the air, barely detectable, but unmistakably wrong, followed him through the maintenance decks like a whisper of something ancient. He tried to focus on his routine, but his attention kept drifting to the strange mold patterns eating their way across metal surfaces. At first, he thought it might be contamination from a chemical spill. But spills didn't pulse. They didn't glisten with a sickly, wet sheen. And they definitely didn't look as though they were slowly breathing. As Corvus pushed deeper into the lower vent corridors, he felt a chill bloom in his stomach. The workers who usually joked in the hallways were quieter today. Their conversations were hushed, broken by fits of coughing they brushed off as the usual hive dust. Yet Corvus could tell their pallor wasn't normal. Their eyes looked sunken, as if something was draining them from the inside. But it wasn't until late in his shift, when he opened the service hatch behind Filtration Junction 12, that he found the first undeniable sign of what was coming. The smell hit him first, damp and foul, like rotting meat submerged in swamp water. He wrinkled his nose, shined his dim maintenance lamp inside, and instantly froze. A body lay crumpled in the tight shaft. At least, what was left of one. The corpse's skin had split into swollen green fissures, each leaking thick, bubbling pus. Flies crawled in clusters across its face, though they had no reason to exist in an area kept sealed and sterile. The nails had darkened, the limbs were contorted, and worst of all, the mouth hung open in a silent scream. As if death had caught the worker mid-beg for help. Corvus' breath trembled. He knew this. He remembered this. The void plague from his childhood had left corpses like this, bloated, discolored, twisted into unnatural shapes. But this was worse. This infection looked purposeful, as though crafted rather than occurring by accident. His mind raced. He backed away from the hatch, but even as he did, he noticed the trail leading away from the body. Small puddles of oozing filth, little footprints twisted by disease, streaks of mucus smeared across the floor. Someone had dragged themselves away from the hatch before collapsing, or something had dragged them. When Corvus reported the body to the overseers, they waved it off with the casual indifference that had doomed countless Imperial workers before him. Industrial accident, they muttered. Exposure to waste fumes. No need to shut down operations. Corvus stared at them in disbelief. Industrial accidents didn't cause eyes to liquefy. They didn't make lungs burst. And they couldn't, spread. But something was spreading now. He returned to his maintenance rounds with an anxiety that clung to him like sweat. The pipes along Vent Sector K began leaking more than usual. The waste disposal units were clogging with sticky organic sludge. Rats, those that hadn't already died, moved in staggering patterns, their bodies swollen with sickness. Everywhere Corvus turned, something felt misaligned, disturbed, as though the hive itself was trying to warn him. And then the coughing started. First one worker, then 3, then 20. A full shift collapsed by midday, vomiting blackened bile onto the metal floors. Medicae staff rushed in, masks sealed tight, but they were overwhelmed immediately. No cure, no containment protocols, no understanding of what they were facing. Corvus stood among them, watching as panic slowly bled into the workers' eyes. He recognized this. This was no industrial hazard. This was rot, intentional rot, spreading with unnatural speed. The hive was falling sick. The air was changing, and something deep within the underbelly of Holion-IX was waking up. All the memories of his childhood plague came rushing back with brutal clarity, and Corvus understood something that no one else dared to consider. Holion-IX was being touched by Nurgle, the god of rot, the bringer of plagues, the lord of pestilence, and unless someone acted, the city was already dead, it just didn't know it yet. Corvus Renn had asked himself this question countless times as he moved through the lower decks of Holion-IX, but never had it felt as literal as it did now. The outbreak wasn't merely sickness. It wasn't chance. It wasn't bad luck or environmental failure. Something guided it, something with purpose, ritual, and terrible intent. And as Corvus continued his rounds, he began to see signs he should never have seen. It began with symbols, strange etchings carved into the backs of ventilation panels he serviced every day. He had never noticed them before, but now they stood out like open wounds. Circular icons, surrounded by dripping lines, mimicking plague sores. They were small, hidden, subtle, but unmistakably deliberate. Someone had carved these with patience, with devotion, with a hand that believed itself righteous. Corvus' throat tightened as he traced his gloved finger along the grooves. They were fresh, recent, and there were more of them than he wanted to believe. Then there were the waste chutes. He had always known the chutes were disgusting, overflowing with decades of filth, but now he found items within them that did not belong. Bones wrapped in stained cloth. Waxed parchment soaked in pus. Little bells tied with green string that chimed softly even without movement, as if stirred. By a breath the hive itself exhaled. He pulled one of the bells free and felt the cold dread sink into him instantly. It was a plague bell. A sacred item of Nurgle's worshippers. Its presence alone meant a cult existed somewhere in the depths of Holion-IX. But how large, how organized, and how long had they been hiding in the shadows he walked every day? The infection reports grew more scattered, erratic, terrifying. Entire HAB units were sealed shut, their doors marked only by red tape and the quiet sobs of families trapped inside. Workers staggered through corridors with rashes that spread too quickly, coughing blood onto their sleeves before collapsing. Enforcers patrolled more aggressively, yet even they could not contain what they didn't understand. Corvus watched them drag bodies into quarantine wagons, their boots splashing in filth that had begun accumulating with unnatural speed. Still, it was the sound that haunted Corvus most. A faint ringing, soft, slow, a bell tolling from somewhere deep in the pipes whenever the hive dipped into quiet. No one else heard it. But he did. He didn't sleep that night. Instead, he pored over old maintenance maps. Maps only janitorial staff had access to, maps that showed forgotten chambers and long-abandoned sublevels the average worker had no idea existed. As he traced infection points across the city, level by level, room by room, a dreadful pattern emerged. The sickness was not random. It was flowing, moving, following the waste channels like arteries leading toward a single hidden heart. Someone was using the sanitation system to spread the plague, and that someone knew the hive's inner workings almost as well as Corvus himself. The next morning, he followed the clues deeper into the underbelly of Holion-IX. The air grew warmer, thicker, as if exhaled by a giant diseased lung. The pipes sweated filth. Moss-like rot clung to the ceilings. And somewhere far below, the ringing of a bell echoed softly, luring him forward like a call from an unseen abyss. He found the first cult chamber behind a rusted filtration panel. He expected an abandoned space. Instead, he discovered an altar. A crude shrine made of torn metal, broken pipes, and bloated corpses arranged in grotesque reverence. Candles of rendered fat flickered around a central icon, a swollen sphere with 3 slits carved into it, oozing with a substance he dared not touch. He stepped back, breath shallow. This was no accident, no random madness. This was worship. A cold shiver crawled up his spine. Then he found the Vox recordings. Small devices tucked into corners like forgotten trash. He activated one, expecting static. Instead, a voice filled the chamber, raw, rasping, layered with rot. "Rejoice, children of decay, for the filth Father hears our prayers. Soon the breath of his blessing will fill this hive, and all shall be reborn in glorious rot." Corvus froze. He recognized the tone, the cadence, the way the speaker emphasized certain syllables. This was a trained voice. Educated, disciplined, not a worker, not a vagrant, not a madman in the gutters. A leader, a priest, the plague priest. The recordings grew more fevered, more ecstatic, describing a plan to overwhelm Holion-IX through its atmospheric purification systems. If those systems fell, if they were infected, the rot wouldn't just spread. It would become unstoppable. Every level, every corridor, every breathing soul would be swallowed in the same ooze Corvus had seen in the corpse behind Filtration Junction 12. Holion-IX had 5 days. Maybe less. Corvus felt his legs weaken, gripping the nearest pipe to steady himself. The hive was doomed, and no one knew but him. He could run, he could hide, he could pretend none of this was his burden. But the memories of his childhood plague clawed at him. The screams, the begging, the smell of bodies piled in corners. He had sworn never to let such horror claim another home. He inhaled deeply, exhaled slowly, and made a decision that would define his fate. Corvus Renn, Janitor, invisible worker, nobody, would attempt to stop a Nurgle outbreak on his own. He didn't know how. He didn't know if he would survive. But he knew this. If he didn't act, no one would. Corvus Renn had never thought of himself as brave. He wasn't a soldier, he wasn't an enforcer, and he certainly wasn't equipped to fight horrors whispered about in forbidden texts. But as he stood in the dim underhive corridor, staring down at the plague icons and listening to the echo of the plague priest's voice still ringing in his ears, he realized bravery wasn't something a man waited for. It was something a man stepped into when no one else would. He returned to the maintenance storage bay after hours, the place silent except for the steady hum of filtration units struggling to keep up with the city's rising contamination. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting jittery shadows that seemed to dance along the walls like taunting specters. Corvus walked past mops and solvent drums he had used for decades, tools meant to fight dirt, not demonic corruption. Yet he gathered them with methodical determination, knowing each one could serve a new purpose. He found an old industrial respirator buried beneath boxes of unused hazard suits, its filters borderline expired but usable enough. He reinforced it with scraps of cloth soaked in disinfectant, fashioning an improvised seal. Then he strapped on chemical-resistant gloves, 2 layers deep. He filled metal canisters with the strongest sterilizing agent he could find, highly caustic, highly flammable, rarely used because it ate through most materials within minutes. It would also eat through corruption. He tested the nozzle of a pressurized solvent sprayer, watching the jet blast against the wall in a sharp hiss, droplets sizzling as they vaporized. It wasn't a weapon in the way soldiers understood weapons. But it was his. And in a hive choking on filth, purity could be more lethal than bullets. Armed with cleaning equipment twisted into tools of war, Corvus descended into the vent systems. The metal tunnels stretched for miles, tight crawl spaces, twisting pathways, suffocating ducts that stank of wet decay. His respirator filtered out the worst of the air, but he could still taste sickness lingering at the back of his throat. Each time he exhaled, the sound echoed like a dying man wheezing in the dark. He moved carefully, but he wasn't alone for long. The first signs of resistance weren't people, they were creatures. Rats swollen with dripping sores scuttled toward him, their bodies warped by corruption. Their skin sloughed off in strips as they moved, revealing wriggling patches of putrid flesh beneath. Corvus swung his sprayer and unleashed a jet of solvent so powerful it stripped fur and rot alike, sending the grotesque animals writhing back into the pipes. The smell was unbearable, but he pressed forward. Then came the flies. Swarms of bloated insects buzzed through the tunnels, their wings beating in a slow, unnatural rhythm. They clung to the walls in sticky masses, spreading filth wherever they landed. Corvus hated flies, always had, but he hated these more than any creature he'd ever encountered. He sprayed them down, their bodies popping like rotten fruit under the chemical wash. The tunnel steamed with dissolving corruption. With every step, he realized the hive's veins were already infected. The rot wasn't spreading, it had spread. Hours passed in oppressive darkness as he crawled and climbed through the labyrinth of ducts. The heat intensified. The air grew thicker. The smell became unbearable. At one point he thought he heard whispers, gentle, coaxing, almost affectionate. They seemed to seep from the walls themselves. Breathe deeply, child, embrace the comfort, let the rot cradle your weary bones. Corvus clenched his fists and forced himself forward, refusing to listen. Refusing to succumb. The hive needed him, even if it didn't know his name. When he reached the lower sewage corridors, he encountered his first cult cell. A ring of robed workers stood gathered around a steaming pool of sludge, chanting in low, feverish tones. Their skin was blistered and cracking, their eyes glazed with feverish devotion. They were so consumed by worship that they didn't notice Corvus slipping through the shadows. He watched in horror as one of them dipped his hands into the bubbling filth, raising them reverently as the ooze spread across his arms like living vines. Corvus knew he couldn't sneak past. Corvus Renn was no longer an unseen janitor. He was a threat, and now, something in the hive was hunting him. But he didn't turn back. He didn't run. The more danger rose around him, the more his purpose strengthened. Because for the first time in his life, Corvus understood something profound. He was the only one who could save Holion-IX. Not because he was chosen. Not because he was destined. But because he was the only person who cared enough to see the rot, and fight it. And the war he had begun was far from over. That was the question clawing inside Joran's mind as he slid into the maintenance ducts of Hive Arcturus, carrying nothing more than a battered tool satchel and the kind of fear only a sane man would feel when stepping into a tunnel that reeked of rot. Up above, billions lived in denial. Down here, it was just him, and whatever was spreading the plague. The ducts pulsed with warm recycled air, but beneath it, something else breathed. A slow, wet exhale that didn't belong to any machine. Every few meters, Joran found another patch of bubbling mold, each cluster larger than the one before. They beat like diseased hearts, pumping out spores that shimmered like green dust motes in the dim light. He had to clamp a rag around his mouth to keep from inhaling them. He knew it wouldn't help much, but it gave him the illusion of protection, and illusions were all a man had in a place where the walls felt alive. Behind him, distant clangs echoed, footsteps, maybe. Or a scavenger rat, or something following him. He told himself not to look back. But curiosity is cruel. He glanced over his shoulder anyway. The duct behind him was empty, yet the faint, slithering sound didn't stop. It moved when he moved. It paused when he paused. It breathed when he breathed. The plague wasn't just spreading, it was hunting. He pressed forward, crawling deeper until the duct opened into a small maintenance chamber where a cluster of malfunctioning cogitators buzzed erratically. Their screens flickered with corrupted data streams, warped symbols, organic shapes, and spore patterns that pulsed in sync with the mold spreading across the metal. When he wiped the grime away, the display briefly stabilized just long enough to show a single message. Do not clean. For a janitor, those were the most unnatural words imaginable. He whispered to himself, "This place is sick, and it knows I'm here." Then the light behind him died. The chamber plunged into darkness except for the bioluminescent green glow of the spores spreading across the floor like creeping lichen. And it was then, in that suffocating dark, that he heard it clearly for the first time. A whisper. Soft, wet, playful. Joreen. He froze. His name. No one else was down here. No one alive, at least. The voice coiled around him like cold fingers. It didn't echo. It crawled. It slithered. It pushed into his ears like infection seeking a host. He could almost feel the breath on his skin, damp, diseased, delighted. He backed toward the duct, kicking mold aside as he moved. But the whisper grew louder, as if amused by his fear. Clean, us. That was when he realized the truth. Whatever had taken root in the hive wasn't content with spreading. It wanted to play. It wanted to be noticed. It wanted him. Joreen bolted into the duct, scraping his knees on the metal as he fled. The sound followed, slithers, giggles, bubbling laughter oozing like pus through the walls. He crawled faster, feeling the hot breath of decay behind him. And then, salvation. A vent grate ahead. Light. Air. A way out. He dove out of the duct and stumbled into a dimly lit utility corridor, coughing violently, covered in flecks of glowing spores. He collapsed against a bulkhead, trembling as the whispering finally faded. But, even then, even in that moment of shaky relief, he knew the truth. This was only the beginning. The infection hadn't just touched the hive. It had noticed him, and it wanted more. He had fought through hours of crawling ducts, fending off the crawling horrors that slithered through Holion-IX's underbelly. He had destroyed cult cells, neutralized infected thralls, and survived the unseen predators stalking the maze of pipes and vents. But now he stood before the threshold of something far worse than anything he had encountered, a vast chamber hidden beneath the city's lowest maintenance levels. The air was thick, hot, and wet with decay, a miasma that clung to his skin and filled his lungs with the taste of rust and rot. This was the heart of the corruption, the source feeding the plague into every vent, every water system, every shaft that carried life, or death, through the city. The chamber was a cathedral of filth. Pipes snaked across the ceiling like the veins of a giant diseased creature, dripping sludge into shallow pools that shimmered with sickly green light. Every surface squelched underfoot, and the sound of bubbling ooze echoed through the cavernous space, as if the building itself were breathing in agony. Corvus moved cautiously, each step a careful calculation to avoid the filth that seemed almost alive. He could feel eyes on him, though he could see no one. Whispers trailed along the walls, faint but insistent, promising comfort, release, oblivion. He clenched his teeth and pressed onward. The hive depended on him. Then he saw it. The plague priest. Not a man, not even fully human anymore. His body had fused with the corruption, his flesh a swollen, glistening mass of sores and decay. A foul censer dripped pus into a pool that spread across the floor like molten green glass. The priest's eyes, if they could be called that, were sunken hollows glowing with unnatural light. He smiled, a wet, horrid curve of skin and infection, and spoke in a voice that carried both mockery and reverence. "Welcome, little janitor," he rasped, "to the heart of all you pretend to maintain. Here, the hive breathes as it was always meant to breathe, through rot, through bliss, through the touch of your emperor-forgotten neglect." Corvus swallowed, feeling bile rise in his throat. The words struck him with the weight of truth. The priest knew him. Knew him from childhood. Knew him from the void plague that had taken his parents. The shadows of the past had followed him into the present, and now they stood as the enemy before him. But Corvus did not falter. He raised his respirator, checking the seals, and gripped the solvent sprayer as if it were the Emperor's own blade. He had no illusions of how this confrontation would end. The priest was monstrous, surrounded by a tide of corruption that no ordinary man could survive. Yet Corvus had something the priest underestimated: determination. Every corpse, every whispered death, every ignored worker he had seen in his life had brought him here. He would not fail. Not now. The priest laughed, a sound like flesh tearing. Do you really think you can stop what has taken root in every vent, every pipe, every breath of this hive? I am the hand of the Plague Father. And you, he gestured to Corvus, trembling form, or nothing. Corvus stepped forward, the scent of chemical fire cutting through the rot. I am no one, he said, voice tight, but I see what you hide. And I will burn it out. And with that, the final descent began. Corvus advanced into the center of the filth heart, the pools of rot curling around his boots, the whispers growing into a chorus of mocking chants. Every instinct screamed to retreat, to flee, to give in to despair. But he pressed on, knowing that if he faltered, Holion-IX would die. The air thickened. The censer's fumes burned his eyes. The walls of the chamber pulsed, undulating like a living thing. Thralls crawled from the filth, bloated and misshapen, gurgling in grotesque harmony. Corvus sprayed chemical fire into the advancing creatures, their screams wet and liquid as they dissolved into steaming puddles. The priest raised his censer, swinging it in wide arcs, spreading pustules and spores into the chamber. Corvus ducked, sprayed, moved, crawled, his own breath ragged, his mind focused on one truth: he could not fail. The corruption was the hive itself, and the hive itself demanded sacrifice. But Corvus was ready. The filth heart would not claim him, not yet. Not while he still drew breath. With every step, every swing of chemical fire, every push through the stench and the rot, he edged closer to the heart of the infestation. And somewhere deep within, he felt the pulse of the city itself, as if Holion-IX whispered to him, saying, "Survive. Fight. Purge." Corvus Renn, the invisible janitor, was no longer merely surviving. He was descending into the very core of Nurgle's intent, where the final confrontation awaited. And when it came, he would need every ounce of courage, every scrap of ingenuity, and every memory of lives lost to stand against the rot and emerge victorious. The hive waited. The priest waited. The filth heart waited. And Corvus stepped forward. Corvus Renn didn't have a choice. He had already fought through the corridors of corruption, the swarms of diseased thralls, and the hidden cult cells. Now, he stood in the filth heart, face to face with the plague priest, the architect of Holion-IX's impending doom. The air was thick with a stench so vile it burned his nostrils and settled in his lungs despite his respirator. Pools of greenish sludge reflected the faint glow of the priest's twisted body, a grotesque parody of worship and decay. The hive itself seemed to moan in anticipation, as though aware that its fate teetered on the brink of annihilation or salvation. The priest's laughter echoed, wet and hollow, as he raised his pus-dripping censer. "You come to stop me, little janitor," he rasped. "Do you think your pitiful contraptions can halt the will of the Plague Father? Every breath, every drop of blood, every soul in this hive belongs to rot. Even you will fall." Corvus clenched his fists around the sprayer, feeling the burn of disinfectant through his gloves. His heart pounded, not with fear, but with determination. Memories of every child, every worker, every victim of the plague surged into his mind. He had survived once before. He would not watch countless others die. Not when the tools were in his hands, not when he could fight. The battle began with a roar of chemical fire. Corvus unleashed a torrent of caustic solvent, hissing as it struck the priest and his thralls. The priest shrieked, the sound wet and tearing, as the fumes dissolved the outer layers of rot. But the priest was no ordinary man. His body, fused with corruption, absorbed the assault with unnatural resilience. Thralls lunged at Corvus from every corner, their bloated forms writhing, gurgling, and clawing at him. He fought with precision, using the narrow corridors to his advantage, spraying, shoving, and retreating in calculated bursts. Every movement counted. A single misstep would cost him his life. Then it happened. The priest lunged with the censer, swinging it like a bludgeon. Corvus dodged, spraying fire directly into the priest's chest. The censer erupted in flame, splattering green pustules across the chamber. The priest staggered, but his grin remained, twisted, unstoppable. "Do you think this ends here?" he hissed. "The hive will rot, whether by my hand or by its own." Corvus realized the fight could not be one of mere force. The hive's internal mechanisms, ventilation, purification, chemical lines, could be weapons. He needed a solution that leveraged the city itself. He sprinted toward the core of the filth heart, pulling open solvent tanks designed for emergency maintenance. Heart hammering, lungs burning, he set the stage for the final gambit, a chain reaction powerful enough to purge the corruption from the city's veins. The priest noticed, fury twisting his features. He surged forward, a mass of rotten sinew, intent on stopping Corvus. The thralls closed in, a tide of disease and hatred. Corvus sprayed, dodged, and climbed atop a rusted pipe. Timing, precision, and desperation converged in a single moment. He triggered the chemical tanks. The chamber erupted in a violent cascade of fire and caustic steam. The priest screamed, a sound swallowed by the roar of chemical inferno. Thralls dissolved, oozing into puddles of steaming sludge. The walls shook, the ceiling groaned, and the air ignited with acrid, purifying flame. When the smoke cleared, the filth heart was scarred but empty. The priest was gone. The thralls had vanished. The rot had been purged from the heart of the hive. Corvus slumped to the ground, coughing violently, lungs burning, vision blurred. The hive seemed to exhale, a long, rattling breath that carried away the stench and replaced it with the faint scent of metal and clean air. For a moment, Corvus wondered if he had survived. The flames had burned hot, and the caustic chemicals had left him weak and scarred. But as he opened his eyes, the faint hum of purification systems returning to normal filled the chamber. Holion-IX had survived. The threat of Nurgle's corruption had been eradicated, for now. He had saved the hive. Not as a hero celebrated in the annals of the Imperium, not with fanfare or medals, but as a janitor, a man no one noticed, who refused to let the unseen rot win. And as he collapsed against the wall, chest heaving, a whisper of gratitude, soft, human, almost forgotten, drifted in his mind. The city had survived because he had seen the rot, and had chosen to fight. Often, it isn't generals, commissars, or heroes sung of in stories. Sometimes, it's someone invisible. Someone unnoticed. Someone like Corvus Renn. When he awoke, it was not to applause, not to praise, but to the sterile hum of the Medicae ward. The fires had died. The chemical purges had cleansed the veins of the city. Holion-IX breathed again, purified through the fires and solvents of one uncelebrated man. The rot that had threatened to claim every level, every vent, every soul, had been extinguished. Yet the ward was quiet. The authorities knew. The Medicae knew. But no one would speak of it. No medals would be pinned to his chest. No headlines would sing of a janitor who had defied a plague priest, the very hand of Nurgle, and survived. Corvus lay on the narrow bed, respirator removed, hands scarred from burns and chemical exposure. He was exhausted in a way that went beyond fatigue. His body was bruised, lungs raw, but his mind carried the weight of an entire hive on his shoulders. For a fleeting moment, he allowed himself to remember every face he had saved, every thrall he had destroyed, every chamber of rot he had burned away. And then he returned to work. No one noticed him walking through the halls. No one celebrated his presence. To the hive, he was invisible once more. Yet something had changed. The corridors smelled cleaner. The air was clearer. A child peered at him from a grated walkway, eyes wide, and left behind a small drawing of a man wielding fire and chemicals against monstrous shadows. A silent acknowledgement. A quiet reward. It was not glory. It was enough. And as Corvus resumed his rounds, sweeping the floors and polishing the metal surfaces of the lower decks, he knew the truth. Holion-IX was alive today because of someone unseen, someone unrecognized, someone who dared to notice what others ignored. There would be no parades, no fanfare, no records in the official logs. But the city would remember, in its own way, through the clean air and the continued heartbeat of the ventilation systems. For Corvus Renn, janitor of the Forgotten Decks, the war was over. But the whispers in the vents, the faint echoes of rot, and the distant, patient stirrings of something waiting in the shadows reminded him that vigilance was eternal. The Hive survived today, but tomorrow, it might not. And that, perhaps, was the lesson he carried quietly with him. Sometimes, the greatest shield an Imperium world has, is the man everyone walks past without seeing. Holion-IX had survived. The filth heart had been purged, the plague priest defeated, the cultists destroyed. The Hive breathed again, its air clean and mechanical systems humming in steady rhythm. And yet, Corvus Renn felt no relief. Victory had come at a cost that lingered not only in his muscles and lungs but in the very air around him. Weeks passed, and the city returned to its routine. Workers marched through the streets, children played on graded walkways, and overseers boasted that Holion-IX had weathered the crisis. But Corvus knew the truth: the rot never truly left. It had been burned, yes, but some spores survived. Some whispers persisted in the ducts. Sometimes, in the dead of night, he could hear them, soft, almost imperceptible, murmuring through the ventilation shafts, brushing past the edges of consciousness. One evening, as he performed his usual maintenance rounds, he paused at a service hatch deep within level 32. A faint green shimmer crawled along the metal seams. He crouched, examining it closely. It wasn't mold. Not yet. It was something else, something deliberate. Someone had returned, or some new seed of corruption had taken root. He felt the familiar tightening of dread in his chest. The city had survived today, but survival was temporary. Nurgle's touch was patient, eternal, waiting for the slightest neglect. Corvus pressed his gloved hand to the metal, inhaling the sterile scent of his cleaning agents mixed with that faint, nauseating undertone. It reminded him of every battle he had fought, every corridor of death he had traversed, every scream he had heard echoing in the Underhive. And he realized something chilling: the war was far from over. He had been the city's shield this time, but what if the rot returned in ways even more insidious, more hidden? The shadows of Holion-IX seemed to lean closer. The pipes whispered faintly. The distant, wet hum of the vents was not merely machinery, it was alive in some small, corrupted way. Corvus straightened, adjusting his respirator and gripping his sprayer. He had no illusions of glory, no illusions of recognition. The Hive did not need heroes. It needed vigilance, and that vigilance would fall on him. Always. He walked on, silently, cleaning surfaces, sealing vents, and inspecting ducts with meticulous care. Every puddle, every smear, every whisper in the dark became a signal, a warning, a test. He had survived death once before, saved a city from annihilation, and stared into the face of corruption itself. He could do it again. But somewhere deep below, in a forgotten vent, in the bowels of the city, something shifted. A pulse of green light flickered briefly in the darkness, almost like a heartbeat. A whisper hissed, soft and mocking, carrying a single promise. "We wait, and we remember." Corvus paused, inhaled slowly, and whispered back, not to the rot, but to himself. "Then I will be here to stop you." The city slept, oblivious, and the janitor walked on, alone yet unyielding. The battle was won, but the war was eternal. Corvus Renn, the janitor who had stared into the face of Holion-IX's corruption and survived, now understood this better than anyone. The Hive thrummed quietly around him, unaware of the horror it had almost succumbed to. Streets buzzed with workers, lights flickered in habit, and the machinery hummed its endless industrial tune. To everyone else, the city had returned to normal. To Corvus, nothing had returned to normal. The air carried a faint trace of rot, almost imperceptible but unmistakable. In the ducts, the faintest whispers still lingered, as though the plague itself was testing him, remembering him, learning him. He moved through the maintenance corridors, sprayer in hand, respirator strapped firmly. Every surface he cleaned was a small battle. Every vent he inspected was a skirmish in a war no one else would ever know. Holion-IX slept, oblivious. Corvus watched.